Section 19, Procuring Cause and Buyer Agency Introduction. One buyer, two agents, one commission. Throughout this course, we have discussed agency disclosure, buyer representation, implied agency, limited dual representation, and the importance of clearly defining agency relationships from the beginning of a transaction. One of the reasons these discussions are so important is because agency and compensation are often closely connected. Now we turn to a topic that has created countless disputes among real estate professionals over the years: procuring cause. Most agents have either experienced a procuring cause dispute firsthand or know someone who has. The situation usually begins innocently enough. A buyer meets one agent at an open house, another agent shows them homes, and a third agent ends up writing the offer. When the transaction closes, everyone suddenly wants to know who earned the commission. The answer is not always as simple as determining who wrote the contract. Instead, the issue often comes down to procuring cause. What is procuring cause? Procuring cause is the legal and professional standard used to determine which real estate licensee is entitled to compensation when more than one agent claims involvement in a transaction. It is generally defined as the uninterrupted chain of events initiated by a real estate professional that directly results in a buyer purchasing a property and successfully closing the transaction. One of the biggest misconceptions among agents is that the person who writes the offer automatically earns the commission. That is not always true. Procuring cause looks at the entire transaction, including who introduced the buyer to the property, who maintained contact, who provided services throughout the process, and whether there was a break in the relationship that caused another agent to become involved. The difference between agency and procuring cause. Many new agents confuse agency and procuring cause, but they are not the same thing. Agency determines who a licensee represents. Procuring cause determines who may be entitled to compensation. An agent may have an agency relationship with a buyer and still become involved in a commission dispute. Likewise, an agent may have shown a property without ever establishing a formal agency relationship, and later claim that their efforts were the reason the transaction occurred. This distinction has become even more important in today's market as buyer representation agreements and compensation practices continue to evolve. A common real-world example. Imagine a buyer attends an open house hosted by agent Sarah. Sarah spends considerable time explaining the property, discussing the neighborhood, answering questions, and introducing the buyer to the home. The buyer leaves interested, but does not make an offer. 2 weeks later, the buyer contacts agent Mike after finding his information online. Mike schedules another showing, helps the buyer obtain financing, writes the offer, and guides the transaction through closing. When the sale closes, both agents believe they played a significant role in the transaction. Sarah believes she introduced the buyer to the property. Mike believes he handled the transaction from contract to closing. This type of situation is exactly why procuring cause disputes occur. Arbitration panels often examine the entire sequence of events to determine which agent's efforts ultimately resulted in the sale. What factors are considered? When a procuring cause dispute arises, several factors may be evaluated. The first question often involves who introduced the property to the buyer. However, that factor alone rarely determines the outcome. Decision makers may also examine whether the agent maintained consistent communication with the buyer, whether there was a break in contact, whether another agent became involved because the buyer was dissatisfied, and whether any written agreements existed. The buyer's understanding of who represented them may also be considered. This is one reason procuring cause disputes can become complicated. Every situation is unique, and no single factor automatically controls the outcome. The importance of the buyer-broker agreement. One of the biggest lessons from procuring cause disputes is the importance of having a written buyer-broker exclusive employment agreement. As we discussed earlier in this course, buyer representation agreements establish the relationship between the buyer and broker. They explain the services being provided, the duration of the relationship, the obligations of both parties, and how compensation will be handled. The course material identifies the buyer-broker agreement as one of the most effective tools for avoiding procuring cause disputes because it creates a clear contractual relationship between the buyer and broker. Without a written agreement, an agent may be forced to rely solely on the subjective procuring cause standard to defend their claim for compensation. The market has changed. Historically, many buyer agents relied on compensation being offered through the MLS. Today's market requires more intentional conversations regarding compensation. The course material explains that buyer agents should no longer assume compensation will automatically be available. Instead, compensation should be discussed openly with buyers and addressed through written agreements. This change has made buyer representation agreements more important than ever before. Not only do they establish agency, but they also create clarity regarding compensation expectations. The Seller Compensation Addendum. The AAR Seller Compensation Addendum has become another important tool for buyer agents. This addendum allows buyer agents to negotiate seller-paid compensation directly within the purchase contract. The addendum helps ensure compensation is clearly addressed and documented before closing. It is important to understand that the Seller Compensation Addendum does not replace the buyer-broker agreement. Instead, the two forms work together. The buyer-broker agreement establishes the buyer's obligation. The Seller Compensation Addendum creates the possibility for the seller to contribute toward that obligation. Why buyer education matters. Many procuring cause disputes begin because buyers do not fully understand how representation works. A buyer may visit open houses without their agent. They may call listing agents directly. They may inquire about properties online and unknowingly begin conversations with multiple agents. In most cases, buyers are not trying to create problems. They simply do not understand the potential consequences. The course material emphasizes the importance of educating buyers from the beginning of the relationship. Buyers should understand who represents them and why they should communicate through their chosen representative whenever possible. A 5-minute conversation at the beginning of the relationship can prevent a 5-month dispute later. Documentation is your best protection. When commission disputes occur, documentation often becomes the deciding factor. Successful agents document everything. They document agency discussions. They maintain signed buyer-broker agreements. They keep records of showings, emails, text messages, phone calls, and offer submissions. The course material emphasizes that detailed records provide evidence of the agent's involvement if a dispute arises. Memories fade. Documentation does not. A well-organized file can be one of the strongest defenses an agent has in a procuring cause dispute. Common mistakes that lead to disputes. Most procuring cause disputes follow a familiar pattern. An agent begins showing properties without a written agreement. Compensation is never clearly discussed. The buyer visits properties with other agents. Documentation is incomplete. When the transaction closes, everyone suddenly has a different version of what happened. The good news is that most of these problems are avoidable. The best agents are proactive rather than reactive. They discuss agency early, explain compensation, obtain written agreements, educate buyers, and maintain thorough records throughout the relationship. The big lesson: procuring cause is ultimately about proving who earned the commission. The strongest protection against procuring cause disputes is not arbitration. It is prevention. When agents use buyer-broker agreements, clearly discuss compensation, educate their buyers, and maintain detailed records, disputes become far less likely. As we have learned throughout this course, successful agency practice is built on communication, documentation, and clarity. Procuring cause is simply another reminder that the best way to protect your business is to define the relationship before a dispute ever has the opportunity to develop. Online discussion questions. Question 1. Why is procuring cause different from agency? Answer. Agency determines who the licensee represents, while procuring cause determines who may be entitled to compensation for the transaction. Question 2. Why is a buyer-broker agreement important in procuring cause situations? Answer. The agreement creates a contractual relationship that helps establish representation and compensation rights, reducing reliance on subjective procuring cause arguments. Question 3. How can buyer education help prevent procuring cause disputes? Answer. Educating buyers about representation, open houses, and communicating through their agent helps prevent confusion and reduces the likelihood of multiple agents becoming involved.